The Apex Consortium had always prided itself on being the galaxy's most reasonable collection of unreasonable beings. Comprised of 7 species who had collectively decided that evolution had peaked with their particular brand of intellectual superiority, they spent most of their time in climate-controlled conference rooms, sipping beverages that cost more than most planetary GDP, and discussing the tedious business of galactic management. The problem, as they saw it, was remarkably simple. Younger civilizations kept having the audacity to exist without proper supervision. These upstart species would develop faster than light travel, discover the galactic community, and then proceed to do absolutely barbaric things like question established trade routes, suggest alternative diplomatic solutions, or worst of all, invent new technologies that made the consortium's carefully maintained monopolies look embarrassingly outdated. The Vorthak representatives, with their crystalline exoskeletons that supposedly channeled pure logic, had grown particularly irritated with this trend. "We have spent 14 millennia perfecting the art of civilized existence," their chief delegate had declared during the last emergency session, "and these newcomers think they can simply waltz in and improve upon our methods." The Zilithians, who communicated through complex pheromone clouds that always smelled faintly of disappointment, had agreed with characteristic pessimism. Their chemical signatures had practically screamed, "Young species are like aggressive bacteria. They multiply, they consume resources, and they absolutely refuse to die when you want them to." Thus was born Project Nightfall, a solution so elegantly horrifying that it could only have emerged from the minds of beings who had long ago traded messy emotions for the clean efficiency of calculated cruelty. The concept was breathtaking in its simplicity. Create the perfect biological weapon, something so fundamentally terrifying that it would shatter the psychological foundations of any civilization foolish enough to challenge the established order. The creature they designed was a masterpiece of applied xenobiology and weaponized psychology. Standing roughly 3 meters tall when fully extended, it possessed the shifting, shadowy form of a Kethmoran nightmare beast, combined with the telepathic intrusion capabilities of a mindreaver from the Tau sector. Its hide could shift between textures that triggered primal fears across dozens of species, sometimes resembling the chitinous shells that sent insectoid races into panic, other times mimicking the wet organic surfaces that made synthetic beings question their own artificial nature. But the truly diabolical touch was its psychological warfare capabilities. The creature could scan the minds of its targets, identifying their deepest fears, their most shameful secrets, their most treasured memories, and then twist those very thoughts against them. It fed on despair, grew stronger with each mind it broke, and left behind only empty shells of beings who had once thought themselves the pinnacle of galactic civilization. The first tests at Research Station Omega-7 had been, by all accounts, spectacularly successful. The creature had systematically reduced a team of volunteer prisoners to gibbering wrecks within hours. The consortium scientists had watched through reinforced observation windows, taking notes with the detached fascination of beings who had long ago forgotten what it meant to feel genuine terror. Unfortunately, nobody had bothered to consider what might happen when their perfect weapon decided that its creators looked like perfectly acceptable targets. The containment breach had occurred at 0347 station time, during what was supposed to be a routine feeding cycle. The creature had apparently grown bored with its designated prey, and decided to explore the wider menu options available on the station. The reinforced barriers that had seemed so impressive during construction turned out to be roughly as effective as tissue paper against something that could phase through solid matter when it felt like it. Within 6 hours, Research Station Omega-7 had transformed from a pinnacle of scientific achievement into a floating monument to the galaxy's most expensive mistake. The creature roamed the corridors with the casual confidence of a being that had just discovered it was the apex predator in a facility full of very soft, very frightened intellectuals. The distress calls had been both pathetic and illuminating. "It's in the ventilation system," one panicked researcher had transmitted before the line went dead. "It's showing me things that can't be real, but they are. They're so real, and I can't make them stop." And the consortium's emergency response protocols had proven about as effective as their containment systems. Their elite military forces, upon being briefed about the situation, had collectively decided that sudden career changes in deep space colonization looked remarkably appealing. The creature had been designed to be absolutely unstoppable, and unfortunately for everyone involved, it had taken that design specification quite seriously. By hour 18, with the station's population down to a handful of beings barricaded in the deepest maintenance tunnels, the consortium faced a moment of profound philosophical crisis. They had created something that even they couldn't control, and their carefully cultivated image of galactic superiority was currently stalking the corridors, feeding on the terror of their brightest minds. It was then, in a moment of desperate inspiration that would later be remembered as either the most brilliant or most idiotic decision in galactic history, that someone suggested calling the humans. The humans, the Vorthak delegate had asked, his crystalline features managing to convey both confusion and disgust. Those primitive bipeds from the Sol system, the ones who still argue about the proper way to consume fermented plant matter. They're the only species that hasn't run away screaming from our preliminary briefings, came the reply. At this point, what's the worst that could happen? The question hung in the air like a challenge to the universe itself, which, as any reasonable being knows, is exactly the sort of thing one should never do when dealing with humans. The human who answered the consortium's desperate plea for assistance was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the sort of person one might expect to find fixing broken machinery in the Outer Rim territories. He arrived at the docking bay of Research Station Omega-7, wearing coveralls that had seen better decades, carrying a toolbox that looked like it had survived several small wars, and whistling what could generously be described as a tune. His name was entirely irrelevant to the cosmic horror situation at hand, but what mattered was his approach to problem-solving, which could best be described as aggressively practical. He had responded to the consortium's emergency transmission with the sort of casual efficiency that suggested he received calls about galaxy-threatening bioweapons roughly as often as most people dealt with clogged drains. "So," he had said during the initial calm discussion, "you've got some kind of angry space monster loose on your station, and you need me to come fix your hyperdrive so you can evacuate, right?" The pause that followed this statement had been long enough to conduct a small diplomatic summit. The consortium's remaining scientists, huddled in their emergency bunker, had exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey both bewilderment and the dawning realization that they might have made another terrible mistake. "Not exactly," the lead researcher had finally managed. "The creature is the primary concern. We require assistance in dealing with it." "Oh, you want pest control," the human had replied with the sort of cheerful misunderstanding that should have been a warning sign. "Yeah, I can take a look. Fair warning though, my specialty is mechanical systems, not wildlife management. But hey, how hard can it be?" The docking bay where he now stood was a testament to the consortium's faith in superior engineering. The walls were lined with quantum-reinforced alloys that could theoretically withstand direct hits from military-grade plasma cannons. The atmospheric processors maintained perfect environmental conditions down to the molecular level. The security systems were so advanced they had their own security systems, none of which had prevented the perfect bioweapon from turning the station into its personal hunting ground, but the human seemed impressed nonetheless. "Nice place," he commented, running his hand along a wall panel that had cost more than most space stations. "Very shiny. Though I've got to ask, what's with all the scorch marks? And why does it smell like someone's been burning hair?" The question was answered by a sound that managed to be simultaneously a whistle, a scream, and the sort of noise that matter makes when it's being convinced to exist in ways that violate several fundamental laws of physics. The human paused in his inspection of the docking bay's technical specifications and tilted his head with the expression of someone trying to identify a particularly unusual engine noise. "Huh," he said. "That's new." The emergency briefing that followed was a masterpiece of interspecies miscommunication. The consortium scientists, speaking from their heavily fortified bunker through a comm system that added an extra layer of static to their already heavily accented standard Galactic, attempted to explain the situation with the sort of academic precision that had absolutely no practical application to the current crisis. "The entity," they began, "is a Class II psychobiological warfare construct, engineered to exploit the fundamental fear responses present in all sentient species. It possesses adaptive camouflage capabilities, telepathic intrusion protocols, and a metabolic system that derives sustenance from the psychological trauma of its victims." The human had listened to this explanation with the sort of polite attention usually reserved for lengthy discussions about insurance policies. When they finished, he had asked the single most important question that nobody had bothered to consider. "So, is it actually dangerous, or just really good at scaring people?" The silence that greeted this question was so profound that it seemed to create its own gravitational field. The concept that their perfect weapon might be more bark than bite had apparently never occurred to beings who had spent their entire evolutionary history replacing genuine courage with advanced technology and carefully managed risk assessment. "It has killed 17 researchers," one of the scientists finally managed. "Killed how? Some kind of energy weapon? Or did they just, die of fright?" The admission that followed was delivered with the sort of reluctant honesty that suggested it had been extracted under torture. The creature, it turned out, had indeed been responsible for 17 deaths, but in the most technically accurate way possible. The researchers had died of various medical conditions brought on by extreme psychological trauma, heart failure, stroke, complete nervous system shutdown, but the creature itself had never actually physically harmed anyone. Right, the human said, in the tone of someone who had just figured out that the monster under the bed was actually just a very loud cat. So it's basically a really aggressive anxiety attack with legs. I think I can work with that. The suggestion that he might actually approach the creature, rather than simply flee in terror like every other sentient being who had encountered it, was met with the sort of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching someone attempt to juggle live grenades. The scientists peppered him with warnings about psychological warfare, telepathic intrusion, and the fundamental impossibility of maintaining mental coherence in the presence of something designed to exploit every fear that evolution had ever programmed into a thinking mind. The human had listened to all of this with the patience of someone who had spent years explaining to customers why their hyperdrive couldn't be fixed with percussive maintenance, and then had asked the question that would later be studied in xenopsychology courses across the galaxy. Yeah, but has anyone actually tried just talking to it? The concept was so alien to the consortium's way of thinking that it took several minutes for them to process the suggestion. The idea that their perfect weapon might respond to something as primitive as verbal communication was like suggesting that a quantum computer might be improved by hitting it with a wrench. You cannot simply converse with a bioweapon, one of the scientists had protested. It is not designed for social interaction. It is designed to destroy civilizations. Sure, the human had agreed, checking his toolbox for what appeared to be a sandwich. But maybe nobody explained that to the creature. Sometimes the best way to deal with something that's acting up is to figure out what it actually wants. And with that observation, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly never read the manual on proper cosmic horror etiquette, the human had set off toward the station's interior, leaving behind a group of the galaxy's most advanced beings to contemplate the possibility that their ultimate weapon might simply be having a very bad day. The first thing the human noticed about the creature was that it was significantly less terrifying than the consortium's dramatic briefing had suggested. Oh, it was certainly impressive, a writhing mass of shadow and substance that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously, with what might charitably be called a face that shifted between configurations designed to trigger primal terror across multiple species. But after 20 years of dealing with malfunctioning hyperdrives, temperamental artificial gravity systems, and the occasional reactor that decided to achieve consciousness at the worst possible moments, the human had developed a remarkably high threshold for things that defied conventional understanding. The creature had been lurking in what used to be the station's main laboratory, surrounded by the remnants of extremely expensive scientific equipment that now resembled modern art installations dedicated to the theme of entropy wins again. When the human entered the room, the creature immediately began its standard psychological warfare routine, projecting waves of existential dread and showing him visions of his deepest fears. The human paused, tilted his head thoughtfully, and said, "You know, that's actually pretty impressive. How are you doing that? Some kind of telepathic projection system?" The creature, which had been expecting screams, gibbering terror, or at the very least a dramatic fainting spell, found itself in the unprecedented position of having to process a technical question. Its shape-shifting form flickered uncertainly between several different nightmare configurations, like a hologram with a bad connection. "I mean," the human continued, stepping closer with the sort of casual curiosity that suggested he was examining an interesting piece of machinery, "the neural interface must be incredibly sophisticated. Are you reading brainwave patterns directly, or is it more of a biochemical thing? Because I've seen some weird stuff in my time, but this is definitely new territory." The creature attempted to intensify its psychological assault, projecting images of cosmic horror, universal meaninglessness, and the sort of existential despair that had sent philosophers into early retirement. The human watched this display with the interested expression of someone trying to figure out how the trick worked. "Yeah, okay, that's definitely getting into my head somehow," he admitted. "But here's the thing, I've been to therapy, had to after the whole trapped in a dying ship for 3 months incident. Learned some pretty useful coping mechanisms. Like right now, I'm acknowledging that these are just thoughts, not reality, and I'm choosing to focus on the really interesting technical aspects of what you're doing instead." The creature's form began to destabilize further. Throughout its existence it had encountered fear, rage, despair, and the occasional attempt at bargaining, but it had never been subjected to cognitive behavioral therapy administered by someone who was genuinely curious about its operational parameters. "Plus," the human added, pulling out his sandwich and taking a bite, "I've got to say, you look like you're having a pretty rough time. I mean, I don't know much about bioweapons, but you seem kind of agitated. When was the last time you ate something that wasn't pure terror?" The question hit the creature like a revelation. It had been designed to feed on psychological trauma, but nobody had bothered to consider whether it might prefer other forms of sustenance. The constant diet of fear and despair had left it feeling perpetually unsatisfied, like someone trying to survive on nothing but energy drinks and spite. "Here," the human said, breaking off a piece of his sandwich and offering it. "It's just processed protein and carbohydrates, but it's better than nothing. You look like you could use some actual nutrition." The creature stared at the offered food with what might have been confusion if it had possessed a conventional emotional spectrum. In its entire existence, no one had ever offered it anything except targets to terrorize. The concept of kindness was so alien to its programming that it had no protocols for processing the gesture. "Look," the human continued, settling himself on a piece of debris that had once been a quantum analysis chamber, "I'm getting the impression that you're not actually having a great time here. I mean, sure, you're doing the whole cosmic horror thing really well, but you seem kind of lonely? Like, when's the last time you had a conversation with someone who wasn't trying to either study you or run away screaming?" The creature's form began to shift again, but this time the changes seemed less intentional and more like the visual equivalent of someone trying to figure out how to respond to an unexpected social situation. It had been designed to exploit the deepest fears and insecurities of its targets, but it had never been programmed to deal with someone who was treating it like a fellow being rather than a weapon. "I mean, look at this place." The human gestured around the destroyed laboratory. "You've got all this space to yourself, but it's kind of a mess, isn't it? And I bet you haven't had anyone to talk to, and how long have you been loose on this station?" The creature managed to project a vague sense of temporal confusion, suggesting that its perception of time was about as stable as its physical form. The human nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, isolation can really mess with your head. I get it. Being stuck in one place with nothing but your own thoughts for company gets old fast, and everyone who shows up either wants to poke you with scientific instruments or shoot you with military-grade weapons, right?" The creature's form stabilized slightly, coalescing into something that was still objectively terrifying but somehow managed to convey a sense of cautious interest. It had never considered that its existence might be viewed from a perspective other than ultimate weapon or cosmic threat. "Tell you what," the human said, finishing his sandwich and dusting off his hands, "how about we figure out what you actually want? I mean, besides the whole destroying civilizations thing that you were programmed for. Because, and I'm just spitballing here, but maybe you'd prefer to do something else with your time." The suggestion that the creature might have preferences beyond its designated function was so revolutionary that it took several minutes for the concept to process. The idea that it might be something other than a weapon, that it might have wants and needs beyond its programming, was like discovering that it had been living in a room with no doors when there had been windows all along. For the first time in its existence, the creature found itself genuinely curious about something other than the most efficient way to inflict psychological trauma, and the human, apparently oblivious to the cosmic significance of the moment, was already moving on to practical concerns. "First things first, though," he said, standing up and shouldering his toolbox, "we should probably let those scientists know you're not actually planning to eat them. They've been hiding in that bunker for hours, and I bet they're getting pretty hungry by now." The sight that greeted the consortium scientists when they finally emerged from their fortified bunker was one that would be analyzed, debated, and fundamentally misunderstood by xenopsychologists for generations to come. The galaxy's most perfect bioweapon was sitting in the station's main corridor, its terrifying form curled up in what could only be described as a companionable manner, while the human sat beside it, patiently explaining the basic principles of hyperdrive maintenance. "See, the thing about quantum flux regulators," the human was saying, gesturing with a wrench that had seen better decades, "is that they're basically just fancy plumbing. Everyone gets all intimidated by the quantum part, but really it's just about making sure the energy flows where it's supposed to go and doesn't back up in the wrong places." The creature, which had previously been the source of existential terror for every sentient being within a 50-light-year radius, was listening with what appeared to be rapt attention. Its form had stabilized into something that was still objectively unsettling but somehow managed to convey genuine interest in the finer points of faster-than-light engineering. "This is impossible," whispered the lead researcher, a being whose entire worldview had been constructed around the fundamental principle that superior intellect and advanced technology were the only reliable solutions to complex problems. "The creature is designed to be psychologically incompatible with all known forms of sentient life. It cannot simply socialize." "And yet," observed another scientist, with the sort of dry academic tone that suggested they were already composing papers about this unprecedented phenomenon, "it appears to have formed what can only be described as a friendship bond with a species that still believes percussion is a valid troubleshooting technique." The human looked up from his impromptu engineering lecture and waved cheerfully at the assembled scientists. "Oh, hey there. Great timing. I was just explaining to my friend here about some of the maintenance issues you've been having with the station's primary systems. Turns out, when you're dealing with a creature that can phase through solid matter, you get a really interesting perspective on structural integrity problems. The creature, responding to what was apparently its new designation as friend, shifted its form in what might have been a greeting. The scientists collectively took several steps backward, their advanced survival instincts warring with their scientific curiosity about this unprecedented development. "It's not going to hurt you," the human assured them, with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly never studied the theoretical limits of bioweapon psychology. "We've been talking, and it turns out the whole destroying civilizations thing was getting pretty boring. Apparently there's only so much existential dread you can inflict before the job starts feeling repetitive." The creature managed to project a sense of weary agreement, like a customer service representative explaining why they decided to change careers. "But here's the really interesting part," the human continued, his enthusiasm for the technical aspects of the situation apparently undimmed by the cosmic horror implications. "It's got this incredible ability to interface with complex systems. I mean, the telepathic capabilities alone could revolutionize diagnostic procedures. Instead of running weeks of tests to figure out what's wrong with a system, you could just ask something that can literally read the quantum signatures of malfunctioning components." The consortium scientists exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey both horror and a growing recognition that they might be witnessing the birth of an entirely new field of study. The idea that their perfect weapon might actually be useful for something other than warfare was so fundamentally alien to their thinking that it required a complete recalibration of their understanding of the universe. Furthermore, the human added, apparently oblivious to the philosophical crisis he was causing, "It's really good at pattern recognition. Spent the last hour helping me identify structural weaknesses in the station's design that your engineers missed. Turns out, when you build something to contain a perfect bioweapon, you sometimes overlook the fact that perfect bioweapons are really good at finding flaws in containment systems." The creature's form rippled in what might have been amusement, or possibly pride in its newfound constructive capabilities. The transformation from cosmic horror to consulting engineer was apparently proceeding ahead of schedule. "So," the human concluded, standing up and dusting off his coveralls, "I figure we've got a few options here. Option 1. You folks can keep trying to treat this as a weapon situation, in which case you'll probably end up with more destroyed research stations and a very bored creature that's getting increasingly creative with its psychological warfare techniques. Option 2. We can acknowledge that maybe you accidentally created the galaxy's most qualified universal troubleshooter, and we can all move on with our lives." The silence that followed this assessment was the sort of profound quiet that occurs when an entire worldview collapses under the weight of practical reality. The consortium's representatives, who had spent millennia perfecting the art of making simple problems complicated, were now faced with the unprecedented challenge of accepting a complicated solution that was actually quite simple. "You're suggesting," one of them finally managed, "that we employ the bioweapon?" "I'm suggesting," the human replied, with the patience of someone who had spent years explaining obvious solutions to overcomplicated problems, "that you've got a being with incredible abilities who's tired of being treated like a weapon and would prefer to do something constructive with its time. Plus, it's really good at finding problems that conventional analysis methods miss. Seems like a win-win situation to me." The creature's form shifted again, this time conveying what could only be described as hopeful anticipation. The concept of having a job, rather than simply being a tool for destruction, was apparently as appealing as the human had suggested. 6 months later, the consortium's official records would note the establishment of a new position, Galactic Threat Assessment and Systems Integration Specialist. The job description would carefully avoid mentioning that the position was filled by a reformed bioweapon, instead focusing on the unprecedented diagnostic capabilities and innovative problem-solving approaches that had revolutionized their approach to complex technical challenges. The human, meanwhile, had been promoted to Senior Interspecies Relations Coordinator, a title that essentially meant the person we call when our advanced technology fails to account for the obvious. He had accepted the position with the same casual competence that had characterized his entire approach to the situation, though he had negotiated for better coffee in the break rooms as part of his compensation package. And in the end, the galaxy's most advanced civilizations learned a lesson that would be taught in diplomatic academies for generations to come. Sometimes the most sophisticated problems require the most primitive solutions. Though they would never admit it publicly, the consortium had been saved not by superior intellect or advanced technology, but by the simple human recognition that even cosmic horrors need someone to listen to them occasionally. The creature, for its part, had discovered that building things was considerably more satisfying than destroying them, and that having a friend who appreciated its unique perspective on structural engineering was infinitely preferable to an existence spent terrorizing researchers in empty laboratories. It was, all things considered, exactly the sort of outcome that proved the universe had a sense of humor about beings who took themselves too seriously.